Good morning, evening, afternoon, mortar eve. This is an experiment for me. This is the first time I've ever posted to YouTube. I've had a YouTube account for years, but I've never actually posted to it. And it's coming in the middle of a very interesting time in our nation's history, which is the coronavirus scare. We're here kind of toward the beginning of it. At this time, I can't see. Obviously, I can't predict the future, but it seems like we're just at the beginning of it, and so I've got some extra time on my hands. In addition, I can work from home, but I have plenty of time on my hands nonetheless. And so recently, I've been posting to Facebook some reflections on the 7 deadly sins that I've been going over with my middle school class. My middle school history and literature class, I've been going over the 7 deadly sins, and I thought, well, some people who are not in my class might be able to benefit from some of what I have to say about the 7 deadly sins. And I'm not just saying that because I'm full of myself. Several people have requested that I expand my thoughts a little bit. And rather than trying to do that in writing, which would be painstaking and you wouldn't see for, probably months, if ever, I thought that I might just share some of my thoughts on video and see how people liked that. So, first of all, what are the 7 deadly sins? Well, the 7 deadly sins are pride, covetousness, envy, gluttony, wrath, lust, and sloth. These are the 7 deadly sins. Now, I should preface this by saying I am a Protestant. I was not raised with this particular list. This is a list that is typically associated with Roman Catholic theology. This goes all the way back to the 4th century, I believe. I'm blanking on which church father it was who first came up with the list, and really probably he didn't even get it. He didn't come up with it himself. That, this is a list that is venerable. But as a Protestant, it's one of those things that's kind of like the sign of the cross, where it's an ancient Christian concept that is very foreign to most Protestants, which is not to say that it's wrong. It's to say that it's simply not something that is taught in most Protestant churches. And I first really encountered it when I started reading some of the Inklings, particularly Dorothy Sayers has a wonderful little essay called The Other 6 Deadly Sins that I heartily recommend. But I want to start looking a little bit at the biblical basis for this concept, because the fact is the Bible does not give us a list of 7 deadly sins. The only one of those 7 that I listed that is actually in the 10 Commandments at all is covetousness, or sometimes called avarice or greed. Covetousness refers to specifically, specific objects that I like. I really want my neighbor's house. I really want my neighbor's wife. I want his manservant, his maidservant, his ox, his donkey. These are very specific things in the 10 Commandments that are mentioned. In the 10th commandment, talks about that. Well, so I think that's a starting point for me, is that covetousness is is the one that's in the top 10 as far as the Bible's concerned. But where do the other 6 come from? Well, so I think there's a starting point for that idea in the Sermon on the Mount. So I'm going to turn to Matthew chapter 5. And we'll just see where this goes. I'm just reflecting here on the 7 deadly sins. I'm not scripting this. This is not scripted at all. I'm just trying to reflect a little bit on the idea of the 7 deadly sins. So let me start with verse 17 of Matthew chapter 5. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So what is Jesus doing here? Well, this is sort of a preamble to the rest of what follows in the Sermon on the Mount, which is that he is going beyond the letter of the Levitical law to the spirit. He's talking about, the roots of sin, the sins behind the sin. And so the two I want to focus on here are what he says immediately after. So, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to the court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. So this is the beginning of the ye have heard statements in Matthew, that, where Jesus states a common saying of the time. Sometimes it's a quote from the law, sometimes it is not. But then he goes to the motivation behind it. So he never relaxes the original idea. Instead, what he does is he deepens it. He goes to the root. So he starts with, you shall not murder. And that gets to the root of it. What's the anger that leads us to murder? What's the sort of motivation that leads someone to go that far? Where does it start? Where does that murderous intention start? Well, it starts with wrath, unrighteous wrath. This is Cain. Cain is, first of all, he's angry at God for preferring Abel's gift, and eventually he takes this out on Abel. He is unrighteously angry with God and with his brother, and so he resorts to murder. That's the kind of thing that Jesus is getting at. This is wrath as a deadly sin. It's a sin that can lead us to spiritual death, whether we go all the way to murder or not. You're still liable to judgment. That sin within you is still worthy of judgment. That sin, even if it's not followed through in action, there's still the root of it is there. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. So here again, Jesus is asking us to get rid of the roots of the sin, to root out the sin in our lives. And so that's, I think, what's behind this idea of the 7 deadly sins, because they're all talked about in the Bible. They're not all listed together as the 7 deadly sins, but they are all in the Bible, that these are the central heart motivations. And I think what the fathers and the medieval church helpfully do is, in putting this list together, is to identify sort of, I don't think it's an exhaustive list by any means, but 7 really major motivations behind our sin. the sinful heart that accompanies sinful action, that leads us into sinful action, that will lead us eventually to death. If we do not put these sins to death, they will put us to death. That is the idea of the 7 deadly sins. And I think that's why, despite the fact I was not brought up on this, I have found that I resonate a lot with this concept of the 7 deadly sins, that these are the things that I really need to watch out for. Now, each one works a little bit differently, and I think they all go back to a common root. But I'm going to talk a little bit at the moment about one more sin that's not in the 7 that I think is sort of behind all of them at some level, which is, this goes back to Romans 1. And this is where my Protestantism comes in a little bit, because as a Protestant, I always go back to Romans, which is not to say that Catholics don't read Romans, but as a Protestant, I definitely read Romans a lot. So here's from Romans 1, starting at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. What Paul is getting at is this idea of the root of sin. And in your list of the 7 deadly sins, that's traditionally considered to be pride. But what is pride rooted in? That pride that exchanges the image of God for other images. Well, it goes back to this idea of ungratefulness, unthankfulness, the lack of thankfulness. And this really, in a certain sense, this is a very Augustinian, Augustine's getting this from Paul, but, Augustine has this idea that sin and evil are not things in and of themselves. They are a lack of, or a twisting of something good. That behind every sin is a lack or a perversion of a good thing. And that's something that I tend to think is absolutely true. That evil can't create. Evil can't sustain. It's only God who can. God is the author of all good things. So if God is the author of all things that exist, where does evil come from? Where does it deviate from his design? If he's designed it all, well, it deviates insofar as it goes against the design. But the being itself, the things themselves, are from God. As we look at the 7 deadly sins, and I think I'm going to continue this as a video series just to see how I do and how long I can keep going. As we go through this, here's what I'm thinking is that I'm looking for that root of ungratefulness in all of them. This exchanging of the creature for the creator. Where we focus not on the one who gave us the gift, where we don't use the gift as a reflection of the giver. Instead, we focus on the gift itself. The gift itself is the thing, not a sign of the unmerited favor of the giver. We serve a God who is creative. Now, the other thing I'm going to say in closing, as in terms of my approach to the 7 deadly sins, and my thesis that they are all rooted in ungratefulness, is simply that I'm coming to this as a Christian, from a Christian perspective, but I'm trying to proceed as much as possible from a biblical perspective and a phenomenological perspective. I'm trying to look inside the experience of these things. That to try, because I think with sin, we all have experienced, I think, all 7 of these sins at some point. And so I want to try to get inside to see what is the root of these sins. What's the root of pride? What is the root of gluttony? What is the root of lust? What is the root of covetousness? Where do these things come from? What makes us do them? What appeals to us about them? And that will reveal, I think, where the ungratefulness lies, where the perversion of a gift into an object of worship comes from. So, thank you very much for watching. God bless.